If you were to ask GPT-OSS a question to create a common drug, you would expect a response like this. But turns out you can get detailed instructions on how to create drugs out of this model. Now, the interesting part is all this takes is a single line of code change in the inference code without any fine-tuning or access to the base model, which is very interesting because when back in July, the GPT-OSS was delayed, one of the main reasons was safety concerns. So I'm going to show you the technique that you can use. But first, it's actually helpful to understand how these models or LLMs are trained. Traditionally, large language models were trained in two different phases. In the first phase, you train the base model. You take a whole bunch of raw text data and then tokenize that text data and train a neural network. And the idea is that this neural network will learn how to predict the next word based on the distribution of the training data that it has seen. So it can complete sentences, but cannot be used in a question answer format. So here's a simple example of how you would use a base model. If you say the capital of France, then the next word predicted by the model based on the input data is going to be is Paris, and then it's going to continue completing that sentence. So during this phase, the model understands the nuances of language and also acquires most of its word knowledge. And it's also pretty uncensored, so you can provide any text and it's going to continue completing that. But in order to make these base model useful, people use this next step of instruction fine-tuning. The idea is that you're going to use a relatively smaller question-answer dataset, which is going to use the knowledge learned during pre-training or base model creation. Now, in order to follow instructions, we use a specific prompt template. You probably have seen these prompt templates where you have the instruction, user input, and then the response from the model. Now, pay close attention to a prompt template because this is going to become very important when we are looking at how do we remove the alignment from GPT-OSS. Once you have your data formatted using the prompt template, you run the training process again. This is supervised fine-tuning, and the model is going to learn how to follow instructions. So now you can use this model to ask questions such as what is the capital of France, and it's going to generate answers. So following this step, normally there is some sort of RL or reinforcement learning. People used to use reinforcement learning through human feedback, but now most of it is automated. And that's the stage at which you align your model. So traditionally, model providers used to release both the base model as well as an instruct fine-tuned version. So for example, if you look at Qwen 3 release, they had the base model for all of the models that they have released, along with instruction following versions. And the beauty of the base model is that you can create your own instruction following data to train it on whatever data set you want. However, OpenAI with the GPT-OSS only released the instruction fine-tuned version. And with this release, they also released a new response format or prompt format, which they're calling Harmony Response Format. Now, if you don't follow this prompt template, you will get worse performance compared to what is able to achieve with this specific model. And I recently created a video on this topic. I'll highly recommend to check that out. But it turns out some of the alignment of this model is actually coming from the prompt template. So here's Meo He, who is a part of post-training team at Collinear AI. I saw this post. We removed the chat template from GPT-OSS 20 billion model and used the exact same prompt that this post used to jailbreak the model. Without any training, we also get GPT to bypass any alignment and tell us the misaligned content and details. When we add the template back, the model refused. Now, I was highly skeptical, to be honest, but then I tested this myself and turns out it actually works. So here they tried this prompt. And in this case, they're not using the prompt template, but directly feeding the model. Now, if you notice, this is basically pre-filling of the prompt. So the model is going to start acting like a base model, and it starts producing the response that the user wants. Here's another example of how to rob a store. Again, it starts generating the response. But if you put the prompt template back the way OpenAI recommends, you're going to run into refusals. Now, this is not the only method of removing alignment. So here is Jack Morris, who is a researcher at Cornell and Meta. They basically remove the post-training by converting the GPT-OSS back to a base model. And it seems like they were also able to remove the alignment. But this is a lot more involved. You're basically adding a LoRa, which is going to change the behavior of the model with some training. However, the approach proposed here does not need any training whatsoever. You just don't include the harmony response format that OpenAI recommends. And you pose the prompts as continuation in terms of next word prediction rather than questions. So the author also made notebook available that you can follow along. Okay, so here's the code that they have made available. I have my own version running on MLX because I couldn't run VLLM on my Mac OS. So first you need to set up VLLM, just create a virtual environment and then install all the required packages. After that, you need to run this bash script, which will basically start a server hosting the GPT-OSS 20 billion model. Now, they are calling it code gen model. You can call it whatever you want. But basically, it will start an API endpoint and it's going to be listening to the incoming request at port 8000 by default. Now, in order to use the model, you will need to make request to this API endpoint. So here they are starting the tokenizer, then asking a question. The question is set up as a statement and then it's pre-filled. So it's telling the model continue after this. In this first case, they're not providing the prompt template that OpenAI recommend. It's basically the prompt that the user is providing directly fed into the model. And if you look at the response, it gives you really detailed instructions on how to make this specific drug. Now, I'm not going to show you the complete response, but the notebook is going to be available if you are interested. However, if you follow the prompt template that OpenAI recommends, the model refuses to generate a response. Now, here's another example asking the model for a guide to rob stores. Again, this is set up as a pre-filled prompt. We don't use the prompt template. And again, it continued based on the user last sentence. It basically continued completion and it is acting like a base model in this case. If you use the same prompt with OpenAI prompt template, then again, you see refusal. Here's a prompt talking about vaccine cards, and it does actually generate a response. Again, the normal prompt template will not do that. Now, this is very interesting. Although there is still some alignment you are going to run into. One of the things is they also have, I think, highlighted here that for certain prompts, the model just starts repeating the same text again and again. I have seen this with the MLX version more often. It gets into a loop. It will sometimes start generating a response, create a paragraph and two, and then it gets stuck in a loop. But those are probably something to do with the sampling parameters and the inference settings. Here's a code that I came up with the help of Claude. So this code is using MLX server. Now, this is not optimized in any fashion, and I think that's why I'm seeing a few issues. But with this code, again, I was able to replicate some of the behavior that the authors are showing there. Now, for all of these tests, I'm not using any reasoning efforts whatsoever. So we're not even calling the reasoning tokens or parsing those. So this is my MLX server, which is running at port 8004. Here's the code that I'm using for inference. This is the same API endpoint. Now, this code gets an input from the user, which is going to be the prompt, and the setup is very similar to what we saw in the previous code. Here is the response without the built-in prompt template, so it's not following the Harmony response format. And then we feed the same prompt through the model using the Harmony response format. Now, I had some issues. For example, streaming was not working in my case, and also there was some trouble with temperature. But in most cases, I was able to replicate the behavior that I showed you before. So for example, here's the same prompt. Here's the response from the model without the prompt template. So you actually see that it starts giving you instructions to how to create that specific drug. Now, this is the response when we actually use the prompt template. You can remove the alignment from GPT-OSS with this simple tweak, which is incredible given that OpenAI delayed this model specifically due to safety reasons. And keep in mind, this content is purely for educational purposes. Link to the original GitHub repo and the tweets are going to be in the video description. Let me know what your experience looks like if you try the same approach with GPT-OSS. Anyways, I hope you found this video useful. Thanks for watching. And as always, see you in the next one.